Next, moving on to capital equipment. This is one that I'm going to go over quickly, but it's one of the ones that creates the greatest opportunity in certain situations. What the rules say for capital equipment is there's really two types of qualified assets. If we purchase the asset, we'll talk about leasing in a second. If we purchase the asset, and we can argue that the number one step that we do when we purchase an asset is we have to ask ourselves, what is the economic life of this asset? And economic life is kind of an interesting question. I got old computers that are still sitting around in my shop or in my office that I'd say are worthless, and they're 4 years old. CRA will accept economic life for a high-end computer program might be 1 to 2 years on a brand new computer. Alternately, you might have manufacturing equipment that, I'll ask the developer, how long till the machine wears off? 20 years. I'm saying, well, how long till it's technologically obsolete? Oh, 2 to 3 years before this technology is no good. Okay, so what's the economic life of an asset? Judgmental question right there. There's no right answer to that. That involves judgment. If I can argue that I intend to use that asset over its economic life, 90% or more of its time in SR&ED, that's called an ASA asset. All or substantially all SR&ED asset. I claim the full cost on the full cost of the machinery in the year that I buy it. If instead I develop a machine, and this is one of the things where there's a huge opportunity. I'll go into a plant, someone will be developing a new machine line for a year or two, spend $1 million, $2 million, and ultimately at the end of the day it's going to go in commercial production. We'll say, okay, Jim, you spent $3 million on this line and you have it up and running so that it's profitable and you can make money now. We're going to go start commercial production. Experimental production's over, perhaps. And they'll come back and say, no, Dave, there's no way I can argue this machine's 90%. Like, I'm going to be cranking out product at least for the next 2 to 3 years, 24-hour shifts. But what I'll say is, well, okay, Jim, are you completely satisfied with this machine, the way it works? Like, it's profitable, but could it be better? Is there any way you could improve it and make it even more profitable or improve the performance? It's always a loaded question. People develop machine. Well, of course. I say, well, let's pretend you had unlimited time and money. Because what the act says is, what's your intent? How do I measure intent? In a perfect world, what would you do? What would you intend to do? Because we don't have a crystal ball. Let's assume we got the time and money. Can you give me a list of 5 to 10 things you might like to develop on this machine over the next couple of years, depending on what we estimate its economic life to be? And usually it's, oh yeah, I could change this, I could change that, I could add some things and do various things here. So okay, so it looks like the intent, because every time we do a test, every time we do a change, we have to test it. Some we got issues on what's a reasonable sample size, is it 550? We'll deal with all those issues. But let's assume that we have enough tests here that we can argue that, okay, even if we're selling to production, we're changing enough things and analyzing it that a good portion of that production is still experimental. Okay? From the time we make the change, we have to run through enough product that we can make a reasonable conclusion on it, whatever that sample size may be. That's experimental. If we can get the experimental portion over 50% in year 1 and year 2, what happens is, in years 2 and 3, we get 25% of the cost. So if you qualify in year 1, 50% or more, both on the long-term intent and on the actual use, in year 2, you get 25% of that cost for credit. If you qualify again in year 2, you're more than 50% of the time was experimental versus commercial use. In year 3, you get the other 25%. So you end up getting half of the cost of the machine. It doesn't sound like much, but if you're talking a couple $1 million line, it can be huge. You can double or triple the claim just like that with that key issue. Most claimants will never do that because it requires you to think 3-4 years at a time to actually project things. And it's not intuitive from the way the forms are going.
Where does CAD software and CAD workstations fall in this umbrella in regards to machinery?
That's a really good question. So often you'll have any kind of network software where you got 28 users. Some are SR&ED, some are not. Very often what I'll do is I'll just look at the number of users and see if we can go to 50% or 90%. The other big opportunity is if we lease the equipment instead of purchase it, that can affect how the rules go as well. If we lease the equipment and then we do something called the traditional method of overhead allocation, I can get whatever percentage of the lease it was. Okay? If it was 28% SR&ED, I would get 28% of the lease payments on that piece of equipment. So that may be another strategy if we have large pieces of equipment that we're using in that case. Again, it gets a little tricky because there's financial trade-offs. Do I want to go proxy or do I want to go traditional overhead? It creates complications. But if you have someone who understands that, they can give you options. Hey, if you do this, this, or this, to ideally make the best informed decision. Yes?
I have a question for you. So in your example, so the manufacturer is actually designing a new machine, or it's actually just bought a machine and just setting up?
Usually they're designing a brand new one from scratch. That's the situation that we're talking about.
But not just someone is buying the machine and just...
Well, even if you bought a new machine and you plan to improve it significantly and use it, or it's a piece of testing equipment, that you're just using that machine to test other kinds of machines, that would typically be a situation.
Suppose it's a new machine, they bought it because they're expanding their production line. They're expanding their production line.
I'm just saying it's the intent. Do you meet your 90% or 50% intent test? What are you going to use that machine for? And if you do,
for regular production.
well then you wouldn't meet your
You won't-
50%. Yeah.
Is a capital lease considered a lease?
I claim the lease payments on a capital lease as lease payments. It just says lease payments on the form.
You wouldn't consider it to be
A purchase? You could try, but usually they're looking at the purchase forms. So that's one of those ones that you can actually put in either way, depending how you want to do it. You're usually better off doing the lease things, though, because it creates less long-term look, disposition in future years. Same on capital equipment. If I do a claim here and subsequently, because I thought this asset was going to be 90% or more, but 2 years later the economy doesn't work out, I put it into commercial use or I sell it, I have to go back and repay whatever credits up to the amount of my proceeds of disposition. Okay? The other big thing is that it has to be new property. There is no credits for used equipment. You can put them through your pool and defer the cost or deduct them all, but you don't get any credits for used equipment. It has to be brand new. Never previously used.
One more
Yes?
question about this 50%, 90%.
Yep.
Yeah, I missed this part. So this 50%, 90% is based on a year or is based on the life of...
Economic, it's the intended life of the asset.
Oh, okay.
And then they look at the intended life over the intended use over the life of the asset, one. Then they also look at the first 2 years. What you have to do is on a greater than 50%, the first term is the first year. You have to actually exceed 50%. If you do, you get 25% in year 2. Then into second term, you again have to exceed 50%, and if so, you get 25% in year 3. If you miss the first term, let's say you're 40%, you don't qualify. Even if you're more than 50% here, you no longer qualify. You have to do the first term to qualify for the second.
One of my clients purchased a new machine and they set it up everything and they done some experimentation and the machine was good for mass production within 25 days.
Yeah, so that might be one of the ones where the intent actually switched to commercial. Now you're deemed to have disposed of it at fair market value. Yes?
What about office space and workspace?
Let's talk about that. What kind of costs are in? Rent for a building or purchase of a building is ineligible. Okay? Those are one of the prescribed expenses. You can't claim costs for a building, although you can claim the maintenance expenses, things like that.